My brother has never called me by my name at a family event, not once. It's always, my little sister, said the way you'd say the spare bedroom. Functional, forgettable. I'm Sloane. I'm 31 years old. I'm a federal prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. He doesn't mention that part. His name is Caleb, and he's the one my father built everything around. The firstborn. The one who went into the family business. Whitfield Capital Management, a wealth management firm our grandfather started in Connecticut, and our father turned into something that managed north of $400 million in client assets. When our father stepped back 3 years ago, Caleb became the face, the name on the door, effectively, even if the letterhead still said Whitfield. I went to law school instead. Then I went to the DOJ. Then I moved to New York and started trying cases that involved the kind of people who thought they were untouchable. My family thought I was wasting my potential. You could have come home, my mother used to say. You could have been part of something that matters. She meant the firm. She didn't mean the cases I was building, the pension fraud I'd spent 8 months untangling, the investment scheme that had taken 342 retired teachers in Ohio out of their savings. She didn't mean any of that. I learned to stop explaining myself at family dinners sometime around my 27th year. It was easier that way. I'd show up, I'd eat, I'd deflect, and I'd drive back to the city the same night. The dinner that changed everything was in March, my father's 65th birthday. Black tie, 40 guests, held at the Whitfield family home in Greenwich, a house with a name which I've always found embarrassing, but have never said out loud. I was invited because I'm still on the family calendar. I don't think anyone expected me to notice what I noticed. I arrived at 6:45 in a black dress I'd bought 2 years earlier for a colleague's retirement dinner. I don't love cocktail hours. They require a specific kind of performance, the bright smile, the light question, the ability to ask someone what they do and actually look interested. I'm better in courtrooms. I know what I'm doing there. My brother found me by the bar within 10 minutes. Sloane. He handed me a glass of something sparkling without asking what I wanted. Glad you could make it. Dad was worried you'd have a case. I always make Dad's birthday. You missed the 45th. I had been in trial. I didn't say that. He looked good, Caleb. He always looks good. He has that particular kind of confidence that comes from never having doubted that the room was built for him. Tall, easy smile, the kind of handshake that makes men feel immediately at ease. He'd been managing client relationships since he was 23 and sitting in on meetings our father held. There's someone I want you to meet, he said. Later, friend of mine. He's been doing some consulting for us. Sure, I said. I didn't think about it again. Not for another 40 minutes. The dinner was seated, 40 people in the formal dining room, candles, a caterer from Westport my mother had used for every significant event since 1998. I was placed at the far end of the table, the and also section, as I privately called it. The spouses of the younger partners, a cousin who still lived at home, my father's golf buddy from the club. Caleb was at the center, next to my father. I watched him the way I've learned to watch people in rooms, not staring, just noting who he spoke to, how long, when he leaned in versus when he leaned back. I do it automatically now. It started in my first year as a prosecutor and never stopped. The man Caleb had mentioned, the consultant, was seated across from him. I'd been introduced briefly at the cocktail hour. His name was Richard. Late 40s, impeccable suit, Rolex that was understated enough to be expensive. He had the kind of stillness that either means very calm or very careful, and I hadn't decided which yet. He laughed at the right moments, asked my father thoughtful questions about the early days of the firm, complimented my mother on the house. He was good. About halfway through the main course, I excused myself to use the restroom. I was walking back through the hallway when I heard Caleb's voice coming from my father's study. The door was cracked. I wasn't trying to listen. Not worried about the audit trail. Richard has that handled. A pause. Then Richard's voice. The offshore structure is clean. The problem is the timing. If the compliance review happens before we move the accounts, I stopped. I stood completely still in a hallway in my childhood home with a $38 candle burning on a side table and the sound of my brother discussing what was, unless I was wrong, the concealment of assets from a federal compliance review. I wasn't wrong. I've been doing this for 6 years. I know what that sentence sounds like. I walked back to the dinner table. I sat down. I picked up my fork. My heart was doing something complicated. Not panic. I don't panic easily anymore. I've learned to save that for later alone, when it won't show on my face. What I was feeling was closer to a specific kind of grief that I've never found the right word for. The grief of having a suspicion confirmed that you were hoping without realizing it was wrong. I kept eating. I smiled at my father's golf buddy. I asked my cousin about his job. And underneath the table, I texted my colleague Owen. Owen is not my boyfriend, not my best friend, not my roommate. He is a forensic accountant who has worked adjacent to our office on 4 separate cases and who I have eaten lunch with approximately once a month for 2 years. He is also the kind of person who answers texts at 8:47 p.m. on a Saturday. I need you to quietly run a name for me. Richard, I added the last name I'd seen on the place card, and any connection to Whitfield Capital Management. Don't ask me why yet. He read it within 3 minutes. He sent back a single word, tonight, if you can. Give me an hour. The dinner continued. Caleb gave a toast that made my mother cry in the good way. My father stood up and said things about legacy, about what it means to build something that lasts, about family being the only investment that compounds without limit. He looked at Caleb when he said it. He looked at me once, briefly, and smiled the smile that means he's glad I'm there and doesn't know what else to say to me. I smiled back. At 9:30, Owen texted again. What he had found, in 1 hour, from publicly available documents, SEC filings and the federal case index, was enough to make my hands go very still on my phone screen. Richard had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a wire fraud case in 2019. The case had been settled before trial. The firm involved had been a boutique wealth management operation in New Jersey. The settlement terms were sealed. The structure of that firm, the offshore accounts, the timing manipulation between internal audits and account transfers, was identical in description to what I had just overheard in my father's study. He wasn't a consultant. He was a blueprint, and my brother had brought him into my family's firm. I sat with that for 20 minutes. I sat with it while the caterers cleared the plates and while my mother's friends moved to the sitting room and while Caleb refilled Richard's glass and laughed about something I couldn't hear from across the room. I thought about what I was going to do. I want to be honest about this part, because I think people imagine that having a job like mine makes decisions like this easier. It doesn't. If anything, it makes them harder, because you know exactly what every option costs. If I did nothing, I was allowing something to continue that would eventually harm real people. Clients, people who had trusted Whitfield Capital with their retirement accounts, their children's college funds, their deceased parents' estates. That's not abstract. I've met those people. I've sat across from them in conference rooms while they tried to understand why their statements stopped making sense. If I reported what I'd overheard, I was reporting my brother. If I reported my brother, I was potentially ending my father's firm. On my father's 65th birthday, in my father's house. I went and found the one person in that room I trusted to tell me the truth. Her name is Vivian. She's my father's oldest friend. They grew up 2 streets apart in Hartford, and she has known me since I was 6 years old. She's a retired partner from a law firm in Boston, which is not a coincidence in terms of why I chose her. She was standing near the window with a glass of red wine, watching the room the way older people who have seen a lot of rooms tend to do. I sat down next to her. I didn't tell her specifics. I told her I'd heard something I couldn't unhear, and I told her what my options were without saying whose name was involved, and I asked her what she would do. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her wine. Then she said, "The question isn't what I would do. The question is whether the Sloane who became a federal prosecutor would be able to look at the Sloane who drove away without making a call and not feel sick about it." She went back to watching the room. I went to find my coat. I didn't call the DOJ hotline from the driveway. I'm not reckless. What I did was call the one person at our office who handles sensitive intake, who knows how to receive information from someone who has proximity to a situation without immediately creating a conflict that blows the whole thing up. His name is Lawrence. He's been a federal prosecutor for 22 years. He has heard everything. I told him what I heard. I told him Owen's findings. I told him whose firm it was. There was a pause. Are you still on the property? Driveway, I said. Go home. Don't talk to your brother. Don't indicate anything changed. Write down exactly what you heard, word for word, in a personal memo before you sleep tonight. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Another pause. This is going to be hard. I know that too. Go home, Sloane. I drove home alone. I wrote the memo. I didn't sleep well. What happened next took 4 months, and I'm going to compress it here because the mechanics are less important than what they meant. Our office referred the matter to a separate unit to eliminate any conflict. That unit opened an inquiry. Owen's initial findings turned out to be the first thread in something considerably larger. Richard had been operating variations of the same scheme across 3 firms over 11 years, and Whitfield Capital was the most recent. The offshore structure involved accounts in 2 jurisdictions that required coordination with another federal agency. My brother had not originated the scheme. He had been recruited into it by Richard, who had specifically targeted firms with strong reputations and aging founders who were beginning to step back from day-to-day oversight. My father didn't know. I want to say that clearly because it matters. My father didn't know. Caleb had believed, or had allowed himself to believe, that what Richard was describing was aggressive but legal tax optimization. Whether that belief was genuine or willfully blind is a question I don't have a clean answer to. Even now, I've prosecuted people in both categories. The law treats them differently. My feelings about it are more complicated than the law. The morning the investigators arrived at the firm's Greenwich office, I was in New York. I had not been told in advance. I found out when my mother called me, her voice in a register I had never heard from her before, asking if I knew what was happening. Mom, there are federal agents here, Sloane. At the office, they won't tell us why. I had prepared for this call. I had thought about it many times over 4 months. I had decided what I was going to say, which was as close to the truth as I could get without compromising anything. I know. I need you to let them do their work. Silence. Did you? She stopped. Sloane, did you know about this? I found out something at the birthday dinner. I had a legal obligation, Mom. The silence that followed was the longest 20 seconds of my adult life. Then she said, was it bad? What they were doing. I thought about the 342 retired teachers in Ohio. I thought about the pension fund case I'd worked for 8 months. I thought about all the people who trust all the institutions they're told to trust and have no recourse when those institutions fail them. Yes, I said, it was bad. She hung up. She called back 40 minutes later, calmer, and we talked for an hour. It was not an easy conversation. It was honest in a way our conversations had rarely been, and by the end of it I felt closer to her than I had in years, even though almost nothing between us was resolved. My brother called me 6 days later. I had been advised not to speak with him about the matter, and I told him that at the start of the call. I'm not calling about that, he said. I'm calling because I need you to understand something. I waited. I didn't think people would get hurt. I thought it was just accounting. I've heard this before. I have sat across a table from people who said almost exactly these words in different configurations. I know what it means, and I know what it doesn't mean. I believe you thought that, I said. I don't know how much that changes. He was quiet for a moment. You were always the ethical one, he said. Not mean, just observational, like he was finally seeing something he'd looked past for 30 years. I just do a job where the consequences are hard to ignore. I used to think Dad was right, that you were wasting yourself. I didn't say anything. I don't think that anymore, he said. We hung up. I sat in my apartment for a while. Outside my window, New York did what it always does. Kept moving, kept being loud, completely indifferent to anything a single person was feeling inside a single building. I made coffee. I went back to work. There's a version of this story where the ending is triumphant, where I walk into a room and people applaud, or where my family finally sees me clearly, or where everything resolves into something clean and satisfying. That's not what happened. What happened is that the investigation proceeded. Richard was indicted on 7 counts. He eventually pled to 4. My brother cooperated fully and was not charged, though the terms of what cooperation looked like for his career at Whitfield are still being worked out. The firm survived, restructured under new compliance oversight. My father made sure of that. He's still not entirely sure what to say to me at family events, and I've stopped trying to fill that silence for him. My mother sent me a text 3 weeks after the investigation became public. It said, "I've been thinking about the work you do. I think I underestimated what it costs." That's it. That's the whole text. I read it standing in line at a coffee cart on Worth Street at 7:40 in the morning, and I had to look away from my phone for a moment because my eyes did something embarrassing. I never needed her to say I was right. I didn't need anyone in that room to know what I'd done or why I'd done it. What I needed, and what I didn't realize I needed until that moment, was for someone who loved me to acknowledge that the choices I make come from somewhere real. That the things I've given up for this work have been given up for a reason. I typed back, "Thank you for saying that." Then I ordered my coffee, walked to the office, and went back to the next case. Because there's always a next case, and the people in it are waiting for someone to take them seriously. That's the job. That's always been the job. And I've decided, finally, to stop apologizing for choosing it. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to do the right thing when it costs you something real. Not the version of doing the right thing that exists in the abstract, where it's clean and obvious and everyone around you nods approvingly. I mean the version where the person on the other side of your decision is someone you grew up with, someone whose childhood bedroom was down the hall from yours, someone you watched your father look at with pride every Thanksgiving while you were still figuring out what you were trying to become. That's the version nobody prepares you for. What I've come to understand is that integrity isn't a feeling. It doesn't feel ignoble in the moment. It doesn't feel like strength. Standing in that driveway in Greenwich with my phone in my hand and my father's birthday still audible through the walls, the clink of glasses, someone's laughter, I didn't feel righteous. I felt sick. I felt like someone who was about to do something that couldn't be undone. And I did it anyway. Not because I was certain it was right, because I was certain that walking away would change something in me that I wasn't willing to change. That's what Vivienne meant, I think, when she said what she said. She wasn't telling me what to do. She was reminding me that I already knew, and that the only real question was whether I was willing to live with the version of myself who didn't act. Every choice we make is also a choice about who we're deciding to be. You don't get to separate those two things, no matter how convenient it would be. Caleb didn't set out to hurt anyone. I believe that. He heard a sophisticated argument from a persuasive man and decided that understanding the full implications wasn't his responsibility. That's how most harm actually happens. Not from malice, but from the slow, comfortable decision to not look too closely at things that are going well. Intelligence without honesty is just a sharper tool for rationalization. He was smart enough to run a firm and not smart enough to ask why something felt slightly off. Or maybe he was smart enough to know and decided the question was inconvenient. I don't know which. I'm not sure it matters in the way I used to think it did. What I know is that the people who trusted Whitfield Capital with their savings, people who worked for decades and handed their financial futures to an institution that had a good name, they didn't get to opt out of the consequences. They didn't get to decide it was too complicated or too uncomfortable to deal with, so neither did I. My mother's text is still in my phone. I read it sometimes, not for validation. I stopped needing that a while ago, but because it reminds me that the people we love are capable of growing in ways we stop expecting them to. She spent years measuring my choices against a standard she'd decided mattered. And then something happened that forced her to actually look at the standard she'd been using. That's not a small thing. That's hard work, even if it arrived in 11 words. Sloane made a call. Owen ran a name. Lawrence listened. Vivienne asked one question that already contained the answer. 4 people, each doing exactly what their character had prepared them to do. That's how most things actually resolve. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long accumulation of small decisions made by people who chose, again and again, to take their responsibilities seriously. I made my coffee this morning. I went to work. There's a new case on my desk. There's always a next case.